The mahogany desk in my father's office didn't just command the room, it anchored his entire universe. Arthur Sterling did not look up when I walked in, though he knew exactly why I was standing there. He was meticulously signing a stack of acquisition documents, the gold nib of his fountain pen scratching against the heavy bond paper like a tiny, rhythmic guillotine. "His name is Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Arthur paused, the pen hovering a millimeter above the signature line. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before he finally capped the pen and leaned back. His eyes, cold and calculating as a winter ledger, locked onto mine. "I know his name, Clara. I also know his credit score, his net worth, and the exact square footage of the grease-stained garage he rents in South Boston. He is a mechanic, a penniless blue-collar grease monkey." "He owns his shop," I corrected, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "He works with his hands. He is honest, brilliant, and I love him." "Love is a luxury for people who don't have a legacy to maintain," Arthur snapped, standing up. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering skyline of the city he essentially owned. "You are a Sterling. You are meant for boardrooms, for diplomatic galas, for a marriage that consolidates power. Not for a man who spends his days scraping rust off oil pans." I didn't choose who I fell in love with. "Then unchoose him," he said flatly, turning around. "Because I will be entirely clear with you, Clara. If you walk out of this house to marry that man, you leave everything behind. Your trust fund, your position at Sterling Enterprises, your inheritance, and your family name. I will strip it all away. You will be dead to me. Choose wisely." I looked at the man who had raised me after my mother passed, a man who viewed relationships as mergers and acquisitions. The fear that had plagued me for weeks suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "I already chose," I said quietly. I turned and walked out, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me. I left my corporate ID, my company car keys, and my credit cards on the console in the foyer. When I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I had nothing but my personal phone, $300 in my checking account, and a profound, terrifying sense of freedom. The transition from a penthouse in Beacon Hill to a cramped, one-bedroom apartment above Julian's auto repair shop was a shock to my system, but not in the way my father would have predicted. There were no silk sheets, and the radiators clanked like angry ghosts every time the heat kicked on. The faint, pervasive scent of motor oil and citrus-based hand cleaner became the background aroma of my new life. Yet, I had never been happier. Julian was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, that first night. When I told him what had happened, his face didn't pale with panic over lost millions. He just wrapped his strong, calloused arms around me, burying his face in my hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my skin. "I'm sorry I cost you your family." "You didn't cost me anything," I murmured, holding onto him tightly. "They threw me away. You're my family now." Over the next year, we built a life from scratch. I found a job as a junior copywriter at a small, boutique advertising agency, earning a fraction of my old salary, but deriving an immense sense of pride from paying my own bills. Julian worked 12-hour days at the shop. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was an artist with machinery. He restored classic European sports cars with a reverence that borders on religious. Clients loved him because he was fiercely honest, often fixing minor issues for free and charging a quarter of what the luxury dealerships demanded. We ate cheap takeout on the floor of our living room because we couldn't afford a dining table yet. We laughed until our stomachs hurt over the absurdity of daytime television. For the first time in my 25 years, I was allowed to make a mistake without it being factored into a corporate risk assessment matrix. When Julian slid a simple, unadorned silver band onto my finger on a rainy Tuesday evening in our kitchen, there were no cameras, no publicists, and no societal expectations. It was just us. "It's not a diamond," he said, looking down at our joined hands, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "But I promise you, Clara, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this." "It's perfect," I said, tears blurring my vision. We decided on a small, private wedding. just a courthouse ceremony with two of Julian's closest friends as witnesses, followed by a small dinner at a local bistro. But as the date approached, a stubborn, aching part of me wished my father could see how wrong he was. I wanted him to see that I hadn't ruined my life. I had saved it. Against my better judgment, I mailed an invitation to his estate. I didn't expect a response, and for weeks I received none. Then, 3 days before the wedding, a courier arrived at my office. He handed me a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the Sterling crest. Inside was the original invitation I had sent, defaced. My father had drawn a thick, black line through Julian's name, and underneath it, he had written in his unmistakable, elegant script, "A Sterling does not celebrate a tragedy. Do not contact me again." The cruelty of it stung, a sharp reminder that to Arthur Sterling, I was no longer a daughter, but a defective product he had successfully recalled from his life. I threw the note in the trash and resolved to never look back. The morning of our wedding was crisp, clear, and perfectly blue. I wore a simple white silk slip dress I bought off the rack, and Julian looked breathtakingly handsome in a charcoal suit that he had saved up for months to buy. Because we were keeping things intimate, Julian had suggested we host a post-ceremony luncheon at the country estate of an old family friend of his. He had been vague about the details, only saying that the friend owed him a massive favor for restoring a vintage Aston Martin and had offered up his private property for the afternoon. I didn't question it. I trusted him implicitly, and honestly, the idea of a quiet garden lunch sounded idyllic compared to the sterile country clubs my father frequented. We were married in a 5-minute ceremony at City Hall. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, a profound sense of peace washed over me. I was Clara Vance now. I had shed the weight of the Sterling name and all the expectations that came with it. As we walked out down the stone steps of City Hall, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. "Our chariot awaits," Julian joked, opening the door for me. "Your friend is very generous," I said, smiling as I slid onto the leather seat. "He's a good guy. He appreciates hard work," Julian replied, slipping in beside me and taking my hand. The drive took us out of the city, moving past the manicured suburbs and deep into the rolling hills of the Massachusetts countryside. As the scenery grew more affluent, I noticed the roads becoming strangely familiar. When the car turned down a long, winding avenue lined with ancient, towering oak trees, my heart skipped a beat. Up ahead, situated on a sprawling hill that overlooked a private lake, was the Somerset Country Club, the most exclusive, restrictively expensive club in the entire state. It was a place where memberships were inherited, not bought, and where my father spent every single Saturday afternoon playing golf with senators and tech moguls. "Julian," I said, my voice tight with sudden anxiety, "where are we going? This is Somerset." "Yeah, my friend has a place right adjacent to it," Julian said, his expression completely calm, though there was a strange, unreadable spark in his eyes. "Actually, his property shares a border with the club's main lawn. Don't worry, honey, it's fine." The town car didn't pull into the main club gates. Instead, it took a private access road that led to an enormous, gated estate that shared a sprawling, manicured hedge with the Somerset golf course. The iron gates swung open automatically as we approached. The property was staggering, a massive, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece of stone and glass that made my father's historic estate look modest. The car stopped in the sweeping circular driveway. A butler in a flawless suit stepped forward to open my door. "Welcome home, Mr. Vance. Mrs. Vance," the butler said with a crisp, deeply respectful bow. I froze, my foot halfway out of the car. I looked at Julian, my brain scrambling to process the words. "Mr. Vance." Before I could ask the frantic question forming in my throat, a loud, rhythmic thudding sound began to vibrate through the air, shaking the very glass of the car windows. It was a deep, mechanical roar that grew louder by the second, originating from just beyond the pristine tree line of the property. Julian smiled, a brilliant, genuine expression that I had never seen look so sharp. He took my hand and helped me out of the car. "Come on," he said gently, guiding me toward the wide, sprawling, manicured lawn that bordered the Somerset Country Club's 18th hole. I think my parents just arrived. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that rattled the marrow in my bones. The manicured grass of the estate whipped violently into green waves as a sleek, matte black private helicopter crested the tree line. It didn't bear the logo of a commercial charter company. Instead, a minimalist, silver geometric crest was embossed elegantly on its tail. The exact same crest I now noticed etched into the glass entry doors of the mansion behind us. The aircraft hovered for a moment over the expansive, private helipad situated right on the edge of the property line, just yards away from the pristine, manicured putting green of Somerset Country Club's famous 18th hole. As the helicopter touched down with practiced ease, the blades began their slow, whistling deceleration. I stood frozen, my hand gripped tightly in Julian's. My mind was spinning in 100 different directions, trying to reconcile the man who spent his nights scrubbing engine grease from beneath his fingernails with the absolute spectacle unfolding before me. "Julian," I whispered, though my voice was nearly swallowed by the dying whine of the rotors. "What is this? Who are they?" He didn't get a chance to answer. The helicopter door slid open, and a sleek motorized step lowered itself to the tarmac. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a tailored navy suit stepped out, followed by a woman possessing an understated, regal elegance. She wore a cream-colored Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in a flawless bob. Despite the casual environment, they moved with the effortless, unshakable confidence of people who own the air they breathed. "Mom, Dad," Julian said, his voice carrying across the lawn as he stepped forward, pulling me gently along with him. "Glad you could make it." The older man broke into a wide, warm smile that completely transformed his stern features, revealing the exact same laugh lines around his eyes that I had fallen in love with on Julian. He marched over and threw his arms around my husband in a fierce, silent embrace, clapping him on the back. "We wouldn't miss our only son's wedding for the world, Julian," his mother said, her voice like warm silk. She stepped forward, ignoring the grass beneath her designer heels, and turned her brilliant, searching eyes onto me. The warmth in them was instantaneous. "And you must be Clara." "Oh, sweetheart, you are absolutely beautiful." Before I could properly process the word son, she folded me into a gentle, fragrant hug that smelled of expensive jasmine and genuine maternal warmth. A stark contrast to the stiff, distant air of the high society women my father had always surrounded me with. I am so pleased to meet you," I stammered, looking helplessly from her to Julian, and then to the older man who was now offering me a warm, calloused hand. "Arthur Vance," the man said, his grip firm and grounding. "But you can call me Art. I know you have a lot of questions, Clara, and frankly, my son deserves a swift kick in the shin for keeping you in the dark for so long." But we had to respect his wishes. "His wishes," I echoed, the pieces of the puzzle violently colliding in my brain. Vance. The name hadn't registered before because it was so common, but as I looked at the private helicopter, the sprawling estate, and the sheer aura of authority radiating from the couple, the truth hit me like a physical blow. Vance Global Logistics, the aerospace and shipping conglomerate. Julian rubbed the back of his neck, looking incredibly sheepish. "Yeah, that's my dad. Well, our family." "You told me you were a mechanic," I accused, my jaw dropping as I looked at my new husband, who was currently wearing a sheepish, boyish grin that made him look completely innocent. "I am a mechanic, Clara," Julian said softly, stepping closer and taking both of my hands in his. "I love fixing things. I love engineering. When I turned 21, I told my dad I didn't want to sit in a corporate boardroom managing spreadsheets and shipping manifests. I wanted to build things with my hands. I wanted to live a real life, on my own terms, away from the shadow of the family fortune. So I took a tiny fraction of my inheritance, moved to South Boston, bought an old garage, and went to work. I wanted to see if I could build something and survive as just Julian. Not Julian Vance, the billionaire heir." "And then you met me," I whispered. "And then I met you," he agreed, his eyes shining with profound sincerity. "When you told me who your father was, and how he viewed people based entirely on their bank accounts, I made a choice. I wanted you to love me for me, not for my family's money, not for a corporate alliance. I wanted to know that what we had was entirely real, uncorrupted by the exact same high society nonsense that made your father disown you. I'm so sorry I kept it a secret, Clara. I was going to tell you today, I swear. I just wanted us to say our vows first, as equals. My heart swelled so intensely it felt painful. The anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. He hadn't lied to me out of malice. He had protected our love from the very poison that had destroyed my relationship with my own father. "You're an idiot, Julian Vance," I choked out, a tear slipping down my cheek as a laugh bubbled up from my throat. "A brilliant, wealthy idiot." "I know," he grinned, leaning down to kiss me deeply, his hands resting on my waist. "But I'm your idiot." While we were sharing this private revelation on the sprawling lawn, an entirely different drama was unfolding just 50 yards away, separated only by a meticulously manicured boxwood hedge. The 18th hole of the Somerset Country Club was bustling with its usual Saturday afternoon crowd. The patio of the main clubhouse offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the final green, and today it was packed with the city's elite. Among them, sitting at his reserved corner table with a glass of scotch in hand, was my father, Arthur Sterling. He was surrounded by his usual cohort of corporate sycophants and board members, celebrating the successful acquisition of a rival tech firm. The sudden, roaring arrival of a private helicopter landing on the private estate next door had naturally drawn the attention of the entire patio. In a club where wealth was measured by the length of one's yacht, a private helipad with a custom-designed, matte black aircraft was the ultimate statement of absolute dominance. "Who owns that property anyway?" one of Arthur's associates asked, squinting through a pair of expensive sunglasses. "I thought the old corporate retreat site was bought out by an anonymous European trust last year." "I didn't know anyone actually lived there." "It belongs to the Vance family," another club member murmured, his voice dripping with forced reverence. "As in Arthur Vance SR. The man doesn't do interviews, doesn't do public galas, and frankly, makes the rest of our net worths look like pocket change. I heard his son moved to Boston a few years ago, but no one has ever been able to track him down." Arthur Sterling sneered, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Old money eccentricity, letting a perfectly good piece of land sit vacant just to use it as a personal landing pad. It's inefficient." "Look," a woman at the adjacent table whispered, pointing toward the lawn. "They're getting out, is that?" "Is that a wedding?" Arthur casually turned his head toward the hedge line, his expression one of bored condescension. But as his eyes focused on the small group standing on the adjacent lawn, the glass of scotch in his hand froze midair. Even from 50 yards away, his daughter's silhouette was unmistakable. He knew the way I stood, the way I tilted my head when I laughed, and the specific white silk dress that he had explicitly refused to fund. His eyes widened in sharp, sudden disbelief as he watched me being embraced by the elegant woman in the Chanel suit. But it was the man standing next to me that caused Arthur's heart to stutter. The penniless mechanic he had kicked out of his office, the man he had insulted and branded a common grease monkey, was currently standing shoulder to shoulder with Arthur Vance SR, the most powerful logistics tycoon in the Western Hemisphere. And the older tycoon was currently wrapping an arm around the mechanic's shoulders, laughing like a proud father. "Arthur," his associate asked, noticing the sudden deathly pallor that had washed over my father's face. "Arthur, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Arthur Sterling didn't hear him. The world around him had gone entirely silent, save for the roaring rushing of blood in his ears. His mind scrambled, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative he had constructed so carefully over the past year. The mechanic, the garage, the cheap clothes. It wasn't poverty. It was a game. A billionaire's son playing at being a commoner, and Arthur had completely, spectacularly miscalculated. He hadn't just thrown away his daughter, he had publicly insulted and alienated the heir to a global empire, a man whose single word could crush Sterling Enterprises, shipping supply chains with a stroke of a pen. "That's Clara," one of the board members muttered, recognition finally dawning on his face. "Arthur, isn't that your daughter? Who is she with?" Arthur stood up so fast his heavy oak chair shrieked against the stone patio, toppling over backward. His face transitioned from a pale, ghostly white to a deep, dangerous crimson. He gripped the edge of the table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he stared across the hedge. Across the lawn, as if sensing the intense gaze fixed upon us, Julian casually turned his head. His eyes locked onto my father standing on the clubhouse patio. Julian didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply raised his hand in a calm, respectful, yet utterly devastating nod of acknowledgement, the nod of a man who held all the cards and knew it. My father's chest heaved. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his own arrogance, the public humiliation in front of his peers, and the sudden, terrifying realization of the catastrophic mistake he had made crushed down on him all at once. "Arthur," someone screamed. Before anyone could catch him, Arthur Sterling's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed heavily onto the stone patio, scattering glasses and silverware in a deafening crash as the country club erupted into absolute chaos. The commotion across the hedge line was impossible to ignore. Shouts echoed from the Somerset patio, followed by the frantic scraping of chairs and the shrill cry of someone calling for a medic. From our vantage point on the sweeping lawn, we could see a crowd forming a tight circle around a fallen figure near the overturned table. Julian's father, Art, squinted toward the club, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Well, it seems your father's afternoon has taken an unexpected turn," he noted, his voice remarkably calm. I stepped closer to the boundary hedge, my heart hammering against my ribs. Despite the cruel letter, despite the disownment, and despite the years of cold indifference, a visceral, instinctual pang of worry shot through me as I recognized the prone form of Arthur Sterling. "Julian," I whispered, looking up at my husband. "He collapsed." Julian didn't hesitate. The easy, boyish smile vanished, replaced by the decisive, grounded demeanor I had seen him use whenever an engine component failed under pressure. He wrapped his hand around mine, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's go see if he needs help." Together with Julian's parents, we walked across the manicured border separating the two properties. The Somerset security guards, recognizing the Vance family, immediately stepped aside, clearing a path through the manicured shrubs. As we stepped onto the stone patio, the crowd of country club elites parted like the Red Sea. Whispers rippled through the gathering. The very billionaires and tech moguls who had spent the last hour nodding along to my father's corporate bravado were now staring at me, and more specifically, at the man holding my hand, with a mixture of awe and sheer bewilderment. My father was sitting up, propped against a stone pillar, a cold compress held to his forehead by a trembling country club manager. His face was still dangerously pale, his breathing shallow. When his eyes flicked upward and landed on me, a profound, heavy silence fell over the patio. Then his gaze shifted to Julian, and finally to Arthur Vance SR, who stood just behind us with his arms loosely crossed. "Clara," my father choked out, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. It sounded weak, fragile, and incredibly old. "Are you all right, Arthur?" Art Vance asked, stepping forward. His tone wasn't mocking. It was the polite, distant tone of a man addressing a minor business acquaintance. "That looked like a nasty fall." My father swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between Julian and Art. "Arthur?" "Vance," he stammered, attempting to push himself to his feet. The manager tried to assist him, but my father waved him off, gripping the edge of a table to steady his trembling legs. He straightened his tailored suit, trying desperately to salvage a shred of his dignity. I didn't realize your family was in town." "We flew in for our son's wedding," Art replied smoothly, gesturing toward Julian. "Though, from what I understand, you're already familiar with Julian. He tells me he visited your office last year." A collective, audible gasp echoed through the surrounding crowd of board members. The pieces were connecting for everyone simultaneously. The Penniless mechanic, Arthur Sterling had publicly mocked and used as a justification to disown his only daughter was, in fact, the sole heir to the Vance global fortune. My father looked as though he might faint a second time. The crimson hue began to return to his cheeks, but it wasn't from anger. It was the deep, burning flush of absolute humiliation. He looked at Julian's hands, which were clean today, but bore the faint, indelible scars of hard labor. "Julian," my father managed to say, his voice cracking, you chose to run an auto shop in South Boston." "I did," Julian said, his voice completely level, free of malice but entirely unyielding. "Because I wanted to build something with my own hands, Mr. Sterling. I wanted to live a life where my name didn't do the talking for me. And more importantly, I wanted to find someone who saw me for who I am, not what I'm worth. I found that in Clara." Julian tightened his arm around my waist, pulling me close. "When you told her that love was a luxury for people without legacies, you missed the entire point. Clara didn't care that I lived in a tiny apartment above a noisy garage. She didn't care that my clothes smelled like oil. She loved me when she thought I had nothing. And that makes her worth more than every single asset you own." My father's gaze shifted to me. For the first time in my entire life, I saw regret in his eyes. It wasn't just the regret of a businessman who had botched a massive merger. It was the profound, empty realization of a father who had traded his daughter's love for a pride that had just evaporated in front of his peers. "Clara," he whispered, stepping forward, his hand extending slightly toward me. I was trying to protect the family name. You must understand. The world we live in, it requires certain safeguards." "No, father," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the silent patio. "You weren't protecting the family. You were protecting your ego. You thought wealth was a shield that exempted you from being human. You threw me away because you thought Julian was beneath you. But the truth is, you aren't even in his league, not because of his family's money, but because of his character." I looked down at the silver band on my finger, then back up at the man who had raised me. "I sent you an invitation because a part of me wanted you to be happy for me. You sent it back with an insult. You told me a Sterling does not celebrate a tragedy. You were right. This isn't a tragedy. This is the happiest day of my life. But I'm no longer a Sterling." The crowd remained entirely breathless. My father looked around the patio, realizing that the network of powerful allies he had spent decades cultivating were now looking at him with pity and unspoken judgment. He had alienated the most powerful family in logistics, humiliated his own daughter, and made himself the laughingstock of the city's elite, all in a single afternoon. Art Vance stepped forward, placing a gentle but firm hand on Julian's shoulder. "We should return to the luncheon, son. The caterers are waiting, and we have a marriage to celebrate." He turned his eyes back to my father, his expression turning entirely corporate, cold, and final. "Good day, Arthur. I trust Sterling Enterprises will keep its shipping schedules tight this quarter. We'll be reviewing our contracts on Monday." The subtle, veiled threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. My father sank back into a chair, completely defeated, staring blankly at the stone floor as the reality of his ruined reputation and fractured business prospects settled in. We walked back across the lawn, leaving the chaos of the Somerset Country Club behind us. The transition from the tense, stifling air of the patio to the wide-open, sun-drenched freedom of the Vance estate felt like stepping out of a cage. The luncheon was a beautiful, intimate affair held on the glass pavilion overlooking the private lake. There were no corporate banners, no press, and no superficial high society guests. It was just Julian, his parents, our two friends from the city, and myself. We ate incredible food, drank champagne, and laughed until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the water. As the evening wound down, Julian and I walked down to the edge of the private dock, the quiet lap of the water against the wood the only sound in the twilight. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "I know today was a lot." I leaned back against his chest, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of him. The expensive cologne his mother had given him today failing to completely hide the faint, grounded scent of the man I knew. "I've never been better," I said honestly, turning around in his arms to face him. I spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table that didn't matter. Today, I realized I don't need a seat at my father's table. We built our own. Julian smiled, that brilliant, devastatingly handsome smile that had captured my heart in a greasy auto garage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. "I know I gave you the silver band," he said, opening the box to reveal a breathtaking, flawless vintage diamond ring. It's cut classic and timeless, catching the last rays of the evening sun. "This belonged to my grandmother. My parents brought it today. I wanted to give it to you, not as a symbol of status, but as a promise that no matter how big our world gets, I will always be the guy who loves you in a grease-stained t-shirt." I let out a soft sob of happiness, lifting my hand as he slid the diamond next to the simple silver band. "You keep both," I whispered. "Always," he promised, leaning down to seal the vow with a kiss. My father had thought he was punishing me by stripping away my inheritance, leaving me with nothing. But as I stood on the dock, held tightly by the man I loved, looking forward to a future built on honesty, trust, and real devotion, I realized the ultimate truth. My father hadn't left me penniless. He had accidentally handed me the greatest fortune in the world.